nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram namashestam manumapi shachiputramatra swarupam rupam tasyagrajamurupurim maturim gushtavatim radha kundam girivaramaho radhikamadavasham praptoyasya pratita kripaya Shri Gurum Tam Natosmi Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Mudake Dato Bande Bhagavatam Imananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohana Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sivak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kodi Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadana Strinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Julisam Janma Janmani. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. So in our last reading we completed discussion of the first verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam, and today we'll continue further into this prakaran on the Nama Mahatmya, or the greatness of Sri Bhagavan's name. So, this is as follows. Having thus described 7 extrinsic characteristics, or tatastha lakshanas, of the name of Sri Bhagavan, the compiler next cites a verse that describes one of the name's intrinsic characteristics, or swarup lakshanas, that is, its being a form of Parabrahman. So these terms are used throughout the Goswami's works. They originate in Nyaya Shastra. A swarup lakshana is what's called the akriti and prakriti, the content and appearance of something, and the tatastha lakshana, or the external characteristics, are the effects that it produces. So effects of Bhagavan's name are the purification of the mind, the termination of material existence, the accomplishment of bhakti, the production of the experience of bliss, and so forth. These are all effects that the Nam produces. So these are extrinsic characteristics. So in this verse we hear an intrinsic characteristic. What is the constitution? What is the name made up of? So we hear the following from an anonymous poet. brahmāṇḍānāṁ koṭi-saṅkhyādhikānām aiśvaryaṁ cetanā aṁśaḥ āvirbhūtaṁ tanmaha kṛṣṇa-nāma tanme sādhyaṁ sādhanaṁ jīvanaṁ ca. The light, of which the magnificence and consciousness throughout crores of universes are but a minute portion, is manifest as Krishna's name. That is my goal, means, and life. So a little bit of an abstract expression. The key word here is mahaḥ, which is a term for light or brilliance, effulgence. So what does the word light refer to here? It refers to Parabrahman, meaning that Brahman which is of the nature of pure consciousness and which is the effulgence of Sri Bhagavan, as explained in the Brahma Samhita. Quote, I worship him, Govinda, the original Purush, possessed of splendor, whose effulgence is the undivided, unlimited, and complete Brahman, divided by the endless magnificences of the earth and so forth, throughout crores and crores of universes. The compiler explains the meaning of this verse in his Lagu Bhagavatamrita as follows. That Brahman, in nature undivided and so forth, is divided, that is, subject to division, by the magnificence of the earth and so forth, throughout crores and crores of universes. I worship Govinda, he ever possessed of splendor, whose effulgence shall be considered Brahman. In this way, the meaning of the verse is clarified. So, Brahman is indivisible, it's all-pervading, it's subtle-most, cannot be broken or reflected or cut up or anything by things that are more gross than it, such as matter. However, it's described here that as such, or in other words, although undivided and unlimited, it becomes, or it is divided, or apparently divided, or subject to division by the universes and all the magnificences or vibhutis, the wonderful expressions, or all the grand features that are found throughout those universes, such as the earth and so many other things. So this quote-unquote division of Brahman means, in this context, that on a more gross level, various magnificent manifestations come about that Brahman continues to subtly pervade. So it's as though Brahman is divided, or that the existence of Brahman is spread throughout a more gross manifestation which varies in degree of density, texture, content, and so forth. And moreover, the consciousness, if we look at the verse, right, it's saying, the light of which the magnificence and consciousness throughout the countless crores of universes. So their consciousness would refer to the jivas. So all the matter, all the consciousness throughout all the innumerable material universes, all of that is just a minute portion of this Brahman, or it's just one of innumerable expressions or more gross manifestations thereof. So, what is Krishna's name, or what is it trying to? What is the verse? The main point of the verse to say is that Krishna's name is a direct manifestation of that Brahman that pervades the entirety of what we conventionally recognize as the manifestation, or of the perceptible realm. So there's a little more on this in the commentary here. Bhagavan Sri Krishna also explains in Bhagavad Gita, quote, I am stationed pervading this entire universe with just one minute portion of myself. Thus the point being conveyed in the verse is that Parabrahman, or pure spiritual being, is manifest in the form of Krishna's name. So this is the intrinsic characteristic of Krishna's name. Although it's perceivable to the ear, it appears to be a gross thing, its content is actually of Parabrahman, not simply, materiality as it would appear. So given that the Nam is Parabrahman, then how shall we regard it, or of what importance shall it be to the Bhakta? So he says, on account of such understanding, the author declares that Krishna's name is thus his goal, sadhya, meaning the ultimate object he seeks to attain, his means, sadhana, meaning his means of attaining that goal, and his life, jīvanaṁ, meaning that without which he cannot conceive of his own existence, or that which is supremely regarded and desired. So as typically people will forsake anything for the sake of saving their own life, if you give them a choice between, dying or giving up their bank balance, they'll give up their bank balance to save their life. So life can be conventionally considered the thing that's the most precious, the most desired, the most highly regarded. So to say that this nama is one's life is to say that one cherishes it as the most greatest desired object. So it's hard to say for certain, but perhaps this expression here in the Padyavali is a source of inspiration for a well-known verse of Sanatana Goswami, which he writes in the Invocation of Auspiciousness in his Brihad Bhagavatamrita, where he glorifies the name as follows. Glory, glory to the manifestation of bliss, that is the name of Murari, by which the trouble of one's duties, meditation, ritual worship, and so forth is terminated, which is a bestower of mukti for living beings upon being uttered even once by any means, and which for me is alone the supreme nectar, supreme life, and supreme ornament. So here, this expression to say that the name is, quote, how does he put it? Paramam amritamekam jīvanaṁ bhūṣanam me. That it's my life, it's my ornament, it's the supreme nectar. This, similar to this statement, that it's my goal, it's my means, it's my life, my sādhyaṁ, my sādhana, my jīvanaṁ. So to convey this idea that one holds the nama as this most cherished thing in this life, in the next, on the way, at the destination, all throughout in this spirit. So now I'll provide a few references for why or how the name is regarded as such. So we find one in the Bhagavatam, that the name is both the means, sadhana, and the goal, sadhya, is shown in Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote, O king, this continuous kirtan of Hari's name, wherein there is no fear from anywhere, is enjoined for the indifferent, the desirous, and the yogis. So the key thing here is how these three groups are interpreted. So Jiva Goswami gives the following commentary. For the desirous, that is, those possessed of kama, for the indifferent, that is, those seeking moksha, and for the yogis, that is, the muktas, this Bhagavan Nama Kirtan, wherein there is no fear from anywhere, is enjoined as the means and the goal. So here you have Jiva Goswami saying the name is both the means and the goal. So what's special about this remark is more so the point about the name being the goal, because the more common understanding is that chanting the name of God is a way to realize God. So chanting the name of Bhagavan is a sadhana, and if you do this sadhana, then you will attain Bhagavan. That is the sadhya. This is, you could say, the most widespread, simple understanding. So now to say that that name of Bhagavan is also the sadhya, is also part of the goal, then what does that exactly refer to, or what precisely is meant by that? Because typically, we have regard for the names of our loved ones, but we regard our loved ones a little more than their names in conventional life. Typically the name is the means by which we call them, the means by which we remember them, and a medium by which we have our relationship with the person. And the person is the principal object of dearness, or the principal focus, more so than the name by which we know them or by which we call them. So how then do we understand this idea that the name is also the goal, or part of the attained state, or the state sought to be attained? So we have the following. And with regard to Krishna's name being integral to the goal, sadhya, that is, it's also existing as a manifestation, existing as a manifest expression, anubhava of Krishna Prem, Sri Sanatana Pad states the following, quote, it, that is Nama Sankirtan, is even said by some knowers of rasa to be the foremost characteristic of a profusion of prema for Krishna. As some kirtan of the names of one's own ishta produces, with pronounced heartache, certainly manifests a profusion of prema. So in the sadhana stage, the chanting of the name is a means of purifying the psyche, a means of focusing the name on Bhagavan, a means of approaching, a means of trying to realize Bhagavan. But after one realizes Bhagavan, after one experiences prema for Bhagavan, then what? Then one continues chanting the name, but this time not simply in the sense of seeking to remember Bhagavan or seeking to reach Bhagavan, but rather as an outpouring of the joy, an outpouring of the feeling of experiencing him, of experiencing love for him. So it becomes what's called an anubhava, or an effect of prema, rather than a means to reach it. So in this sense, the name is the goal, or in other words, it's part of the state of being, which is the end result, or the sought end result of the path of sadhana. In other words, the chanting of the name is an integral part of the expression of Krishna prema. So in that sense, it's understood to be the goal and to be the life of even the liberated. So like this, we have this verse 23. So the name is constituted of Parabrahman, and it's to be regarded as one's goal, as one's means, and as one's life. So now we'll come to the next verse, 24. Having thus described the name's intrinsic characteristic of being a form of Parabrahman, and thus its dearness to a bhakta, the compiler next cites a verse that further describes effects of the name, but does so such that it is understood the name is not only a means to or a regulator of the bestowal of various benefits, but rather the name, as a manifestation of Parabrahman, is itself the bestower of such benefits. So this is an important distinction. And it's discussed a little bit here in this verse and further in the following verse. So I think I'll leave it till the following verse to elaborate on that point. But what the commentator is drawing out here is a subtle distinction between the idea that chanting the name is a means by which one is graced by Bhagavan, and Bhagavan is the agent who's giving the grace, so to speak. But rather what the commentator wants to point out is that the name itself can also be regarded as a form of Bhagavan directly, or as a bestower of grace in and of itself. So what sort of effects is the name said to produce? This is a verse a little bit similar to the first verse of the Shikshastakam, which lists a progressive stack of effects that the name can produce. So this is as follows. viṣṇor nāmaiva puṁsaḥ śamalam apaharat puṇyam utpādayac brahmādi-sthāna-bhogād viratim atha guroḥ śrī-pada-dvandva-bhaktim tattva-jñānaṁ ca viṣṇor iha mṛti-janana-bhrānti-bījaṁ ca dagdva sampūrṇānanda-bodhe mahati ca puruṣam sthāpayitva nivritam. Vishnu's name alone removes impurity, produces merit, detachment from enjoyment of the positions of Brahma and so forth, bhakti to the two blessed feet of the Guru, and knowledge of the essential nature of Vishnu, burns away the cause of revolving in birth and death here in this world, establishes a person in deep awareness of complete bliss, and finally withdraws. So we'll look at what are the import of these different effects that are described here. So the commentator explains that, quote, merit, puṇyam, here refers to true merit, that is, eligibility for worship of Sri Krishna, and not merit in the conventional sense of having performed various types of righteous worldly acts, such as austerity, duties, and the like. So words like punya, sukriti, according to context, they may refer to worldly merit, or they may refer to paramartik, or spiritual merit, or merit in the context of the jiva's eternal relationship with the paratattva. So the commentator is clarifying here that the author's intent when he speaks of merit or punya in this context is to refer to that paramartik aspect, or that spiritual aspect of merit, such that it brings about eligibility for the worship of Krishna. So what is eligibility? As per the Sindhu, it is shraddha, it is yukti, or knowledge of the rationale taught in the Shastra regarding the object of Shastra, and it is purification of the psyche, or chitta shuddhi. These three elements are the principal elements of what constitutes adhikar, or eligibility for the path of bhakti. So the name here is said to produce that, to remove impurity, as it was said earlier in the verse, and to produce merit or purity, such that it produces purification of the mind and it leads to the development of shraddha and understanding. Then it says that the name, quote, the positions of Brahma and so forth. So the name will remove one's interest in these things. This refers to Satyaloka, Svargaloka, and other celestial realms within the material universe. And detachment from them refers to indifference, that is, non-desirousness in regard to them. So, classically, the attainments and experiences of Gandharvas and the Devas and Svarga are described at length in the Puranas, as these were conceived of as the greatest, pleasurable lives that one could live, and animated the hopes and the notions of happiness throughout, antiquity in the Indian subcontinent. In the modern day, people may not identify so much with these kind of ideas, but they can identify with the idea of being a politician or a CEO or, a wealthy investor, or someone who has, great power and wealth and facility and respect in the world, and has a great deal of resources at their command and persons ready to follow their directives. So here to say that the name produces detachment from these positions means if it can produce disinterest even in the position of Brahma or the position of Indra, then will it leave people with interest in, being the CEO of a company or the coach of a team or the leader of some nation? Definitely not. And, these worldly roles that are conceived to be of great stature by the common people are considered quite trivial from the spiritual perspective. So we could also bring that closer to home and say, is being the abbot of the monastery really all that big of a position? Is it really worth all that consideration? Is it really all that esteemed? Is the respect that one gets for sitting on that seat really all that relishable that I'll forsake my interest in higher spiritual attainment and the time I could spend on, immersing myself in that just to busy myself with managing, donations and locks and bills and all these things. This is the thrust of the idea that one will become detached from any notion of, having power and authority over others. It won't be perceived as something relishable or exalted. And then we have Sri Bhagavan's name is said to produce, quote, bhakti to the two blessed feet of the Guru, because taking shelter in a Guru, being initiated and instructed by him, and serving him are essential fundaments of sadhana bhakti, that is, compulsory aspects of the path of bhakti, and Sri Bhagavan blesses those who take shelter in his name with the opportunity to have such a relationship with a Guru, who is indeed also a manifestation of Sri Bhagavan himself. Quote, Krishna says, know the Acharya to be me. One should never disrespect him, one should not engage in detraction of him out of consideration of him being immortal. The Guru is an embodiment of all the Devas. And the commentator also cites this verse in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, which says, quote, "Success or siddhi is not far off for one whose unwavering intention upon deva, the mantra, and the guru is non-deterred. The devata is to be known as he who has a form as the mantra used to worship him, and the devata is to be known as he who has a form as the guru who teaches worship of himself. A division between them is not to be made should one desire to attain one's desired object, that is, should one desire to attain one's cherished devata." So essentially what this is saying is that one will conceive that the mantra and the guru are both manifestations of the grace of one's Ishtadevata. And the Ishtadevata has come in these two forms in order to lead one to him, or in order to lead one and enable one to realize him. So one will regard the mantra and the guru as being non-different and being manifestations of the grace of the devata, and thus show them the highest regard. So what the point is being made in the main verse is that chanting the name also leads to bhakti to the guru, which is to say that by chanting the name and by receiving the grace of the name, one can be blessed to receive the shelter of a Sadguru. So for those who have not reached that shelter, then chanting the name is an ideal way to seek the grace of Bhagavan such that he may appear in the form of the Guru to teach one. Then, Sri Bhagavan's name is said to thereafter produce, quote, knowledge of the essential nature of Vishnu, tattva-jñānaṁ cha viṣṇor, because it is from the Guru that one learns this knowledge. And one is only able to take shelter in, learn from, and serve a Guru, such that one acquires this knowledge when one has acquired detachment from material enjoyments, acquired merit, that is eligibility for the path of bhakti, and become purged of impurities to a significant extent. So we want to draw attention here to the line of thought, or this is implying a progression, that one can achieve knowledge of Bhagavan. But how? One will achieve knowledge of Bhagavan by having a guru who teaches one that, who teaches one the Shastra. So the name, if it is said to bring about knowledge, it implies that the name will lead one to the guru. But can you really take shelter in a guru? Can you really follow a guru if you're still attached to so many worldly things and pursuing so many things that are distinct from the path that the guru is trying to lead you on? No. So taking shelter in a guru presupposes that one has acquired at least a certain degree of disinterest and dissatisfaction with worldly prospects. And will one acquire that detachment if one doesn't have any conviction in the existence of a higher attainment? One doesn't have any purification of the mind whereby the tendencies of the mind to pursue conventional things are not removed? No. So therefore you have this progression, that the name purifies the mind. It brings about conviction, eligibility for the path. It gives one detachment from what is contrary to the path. It leads one to the guide who takes one along the path. And then it brings about the knowledge that comes from following the guide. So in this way, it's chalking out a progression. So what happens next, after one gets that knowledge? Then it says, Sri Bhagavan's name is then said to, quote, burn away the cause of revolving in birth and death here in this world. Because the fundamental cause of wandering in illusion and samsara is ignorance, avidya, of Sri Bhagavan. As is stated by Sri Jiva, quote, the root of the jiva's deficiency is only the absence of awareness of the Supreme Entity. And that ignorance is terminated by the aforementioned attainment of knowledge of the essential nature of Sri Bhagavan. So the core vacuum in which all of the delusion and suffering of the jiva in samsara takes place is the vacuum of the absence of awareness of Bhagavan, or ignorance. So the name brings one to the guru and then leads one to the point of acquiring that knowledge, whereby that vacuum is filled with proper understanding, and that then uproots or eradicates the core deficiency or absence that was allowing one to behave and think and carry on in a self-destructive or self-defeating manner by perpetuating one's own entanglement in samsara. So if it in that way uproots the cause of one remaining in samsara, the implication is then that one, now that the anchor is cut off, one can now proceed and attain something superior. So what is that? So lastly it says, Sri Bhagavan's name then, quote, establishes a person in deep awareness of complete bliss, meaning it grants one engagement in the service of Sri Bhagavan, who is the supreme indivisible embodiment of eternal being, consciousness, and bliss. And then, finally, the name withdraws. That is, it desists because of having no further task to perform, which can be understood to mean that it then manifests itself to the chanter as the bearer of the name, or the namin, meaning it manifests to the bhakta as Sri Bhagavan himself. So I just want to give a little credit on this point. This point about the meaning or the significance of the name, quote, withdrawing, comes from the Bengali translation of the Padyavali by Anandagopal Shastri. And I found it interesting that the Sanskrit commentator didn't offer anything really on the meaning of that. And Anandagopal Shastri, in his Bengali translation of the text, as well as Rasa Bihari Sankirtirtha, the other earlier translator of the text, both of them, for the most part, follow the commentary basically the entire time in their translation. Seldom do they add or give further color or significance to the verse. Anandagopal Shastri sometimes adds a little bit, but for the most part it's not much more than what you get in the Sanskrit commentary. But this I found to be a rare instance where I felt like he contributed a very significant, enriching perspective on the meaning of an aspect of the verse which wasn't in the commentary at all. So I want to just give kudos to that. So to just say that the name withdraws, or to say that it retires because now you've entered the state of bliss, for bhaktas, especially for those following the path of nama-sankirtan, of Mahaprabhu, this is not entirely a satisfying remark, because as it was indicated in the verse quoted in the earlier commentary, the name is also part of the sadhya. It's also an anubhav of prema. It's also part of, the life of the liberated, so to speak. It's a daily feature of life in Bhagavan's dham. It's, the solace of the Braja Gopis. It's everything. So to say, rather than it simply withdraws because it's done its job, rather to say that having revealed all of these things, brought one out of samsara, steeped one in the eternal service of Bhagavan and the bliss thereof, then the name is simply manifest as Bhagavan, or it implies that the name brings one all the way directly to the feet of Bhagavan, and thereafter, one is ever engaged in his eternal service. I found this to be a very nice way of ornamenting or taking out an import from the remark. So, the commentator adds that the purport here is that the bhakta, who is so profoundly benefited by virtue of all the effects described, benefited by the name, by virtue of all the effects described in this verse that are brought about by the name, verily goes on to worship the name eternally, while remaining, quote, established in deep awareness of complete bliss, since otherwise ingratitude would occur on the bhakta's part. And thus continuation of the worship, or chanting with adoration of the name, even in the liberated state, is established as an eternal spiritual reality. So this is an interesting line of thought. Another reason why you could say that the nam or namakirtan is part of the sadhya, as opposed to the earlier reason that it's an anubhava of prema, to say that one who has been brought to such a great state by the name, how thereafter would one ever give up the name? In other words, they would be forever feeling so profoundly benefited by the name to such an extent that they would never relinquish the tendency to continue to honor and cherish the name by chanting it. I thought this is also a nice way of seeing it. Alright, so let's do one more. So this is a very well-known verse and returns to the topic of an intrinsic characteristic of Bhagavan's name. Having thus described further extrinsic characteristics of Sri Bhagavan's name, the compiler next cites a verse that explains how the name is possessed of the power to produce such effects. In other words, why is all these effects that were described in the last verse, all the effects that were described in the first verse of the Shikshastakam, where does the name get all the power to do that? How does the name have the potency to produce these effects? So that's explained in this verse. Namachintamani Krishna's Chaitanya Rasa Vigraha Purnashuddha Nityamukto Binatvannamanamino. The name is a thought jewel, Krishna himself, an embodiment of consciousness and rasa, complete, pure, and eternally liberated, because of the name and the bearer of the names being non-different. So, this verse has been interpreted slightly differently by Sanatana Goswami and Jiva Goswami. So the translation I've given here, firstly, is based on Sanatana Goswami's view, and then after that I'll present Jiva Goswami's view. So Sanatana Goswami comments as follows. The name Krishna is a thought jewel, that is, like a thought jewel, because of its being a bestower of the objects thought by a worshipper. Meaning, whatever you want to achieve, if you chant the name with the desire to achieve it, by the power of the name, you'll achieve that desired result. The speaker describes the essential nature of Krishna's name with the four qualifiers, Chaitanya and so forth. Although neutrality, meaning the neutral grammatical gender, is used in the words Chaitanya Rasa Vigraha and so forth, that is, and the words Purna, Shuddha, and Nityamukta, on account of there being qualifiers of the name, still the word Krishna has masculinity, that is, it's in the masculine grammatical gender, because of its being also a qualifier of the name, even though it has a different grammatical gender, based on the intention of the speaker to convey the non-difference between the name and the bearer of the name, which is shown in the final foot of the verse, and as is seen in this verse from Vamana Puran, cited elsewhere in Hari Bhakti Vilas, wherein the masculine gendered name Narayan is in opposition with the neuter gendered word Nama. Quote, O human beings, the name Narayan is said to be the most renowned thief among human beings on the earth, since he carries away completely the heaps of sins accumulated over the course of many births, even when he is just heard of. So this is quite interesting. It's perhaps a little bit of a satire on the world. In other words, if there's anything that, to be the biggest thief ever, the thing that you would steal would have to be something that's available in great quantities. So what's available in great quantities? Heaps of sins accumulated over many births. So the person who can steal all of those, he really can steal in great quantity. So anyway, this is a little bit technical. I could cut this, it's maybe excessive technical detail, but I decided to leave it in just because Sanatan, by getting into this grammatical analysis of gender, is trying to stress this point of the name being non-different from Bhagavan. So, Jiva Goswami, his interpretation is as follows. The name itself is a thought jewel, that is, a bestower of all desired objects, since it is verily Krishna, that is a form of Krishna. This is the meaning. Consciousness and so forth, that is the words rasa, complete, purna, pure, shuddha, and eternally liberated, nityamukta, are qualifiers of Krishna. The cause of it, that is the names being Krishna, is because of the name and Krishna being non-different. one entity alone, the nature of which is eternal being, consciousness, bliss, rasa, and so forth, is manifest in two forms, that is, as Krishna himself and as his name. This is the meaning. So there's one entity, Krishna, and he has two simultaneously coexistent self-manifestations, his name and his form. So what we get is a slight difference in meaning. I've given a translation of Jiva Goswami's interpretation just to make it a little more clear. So the name is a thought jewel, and Krishna himself, who is an embodiment of consciousness and rasa, complete, pure, and eternally liberated. So in Sanatana Goswami's commentary, or in his interpretation, all of the qualifiers in the verse are qualifiers of the name. The name is said to be complete, the name is said to be pure, the name is said to be liberated, etc. Whereas in Jiva Goswami's interpretation, the name is said to be Krishna, and Krishna is said to be complete and pure and liberated, and so on. So ultimately it doesn't amount to a significant difference, but it's a slight difference in the way the words are applied. Now we'll get into some elongated commentary on the topic of Nam Tattva in Bhagavad Sandarbha 47. I've given an excerpt from that long discussion, which gets into the gist of why the point is made here in the Padma Puran that the name and the bearer of the name are non-different. Quote, "It is not rather that such a statement, that is, the statement in an aforesaid verse from Padma Puran, about only a syllable, namely Om, a name of Parameshvara, that is Bhagavan, should be considered only a form of praise, i.e., to not refer to practically existent characteristics of that syllable. Because of the supposed possibility of only Parameshvara having such capability, that is, the capabilities of being transcendental, imperishable, and so on, as described in the aforesaid verse. On account of the real possibility of that capability existing in Om itself, by virtue of its non-difference from Parameshvara, when solely on the strength of the Shruti, that is, the authority of the Shastra, this meaning is accepted. Quote, this avatar of Parameshvara himself in the form of a letter, that is, Om, is like his other avatars, that is possessed of the same capabilities that they are. So what Jiva Goswami is saying here in gist is that Om, and then by implication, all other names of Bhagavan are avatars of Bhagavan. So as we think of Ram and Nrsimha and Vamana as avatars of Vishnu, then also the Nam is regarded as an avatar. So Kali Kali Nam Rupe Krishna avatar, Iha hoite hoi sarva jagatani star, these, lines of the Charitamrita that are sung with great delight here in West Bengal. These have precedent right here in the words of Jiva Goswami and are derived from statements in the Shastra that Om and thus other names of Bhagavan such as Krishna, Govinda, Hari, these are avatars of Bhagavan himself. And what's also significant here is that Jiva Goswami, as far as a reason as to why they're considered avatars, he simply says the strength of the Shruti. Means the Shastra just says so. So it's interesting that so much glorification is given of the name, so much glorification is given of kirtan of the name. This is said to be the dharma in the age of Kali, so on and so forth, considered a great universal spiritual practice for all people, in all conditions, and so on. But the core theological concept for the whole idea is that the name is non-different than Bhagavan, and by chanting the name, one can have realization of Bhagavan. But why the name is considered non-different than Bhagavan? Here, Jiva Goswami simply says, it's because the Shastra says so. In other words, he doesn't go into a complicated philosophical analysis or attempt to create a set of arguments to justify this idea. Which is to say that it's ultimately a principle that's accepted on faith. So writers like Kanupriya Goswami and his Namachintamani and others have made attempts or given various elaborated philosophical analysis to, so to speak, argue or give reasoning why the name is non-different than the name, non-different than the bearer of the name. But personally, I find it significant that while there's definitely an understandable thirst for that among, the critical thinkers of the world and the philosophers of the world, and to satisfy them, or it may be considered to attract them or prompt them to take up the path, some philosophical justification for the idea can be offered. Let it be so, it may be. But personally, I find it significant that Jiva Goswami, who on other topics is certainly not shy or incapable of going into meticulous philosophical detail, on this point just says that we take it on the authority of the Shastra. In other words, it's a principle that we take as an axiom, and the validity of it can ultimately be verified by personal experience. By taking up the chanting of the name, by following the path by which the name is to be chanted, then one can ultimately have realization of Bhagavan, and there's no point in arguing after that. One has proof positive personal experience of the fact that the name led to the experience of Bhagavan. The name indeed acted as Bhagavan himself. The name is indeed Bhagavan himself. So anyway, I'm just drawing a little highlighter on this little passage, this one little half sentence here in the middle of this long passage, because it's significant that it's ultimately simply an axiomatic principle. Anyway, moving on. Therefore, no difference between the name and the bearer of the name verily exists. This is stated in Padma Puran. The name is a thought jewel, and Krishna himself, who is an embodiment of consciousness and rasa, complete, pure, and eternally liberated, because of the name and the bearer of the names being non-different. The meaning of this verse is that the name itself is a thought jewel because of its being a giver of all objects. And it is not only such, rather it is also Krishna directly, who is possessed of the characteristics of consciousness and so forth. The cause of this is, quote, because of the name and the bearer of the names being non-different. All right, very well. Then just a little more here. There's also some nice discussion of this verse in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, so I've included that here. Sriman Mahaprabhu is said to have explained the import of this verse as follows in Chaitanya Charitamrita. Quote, Krishna's name and Krishna's essential nature, these two are one. Krishna's name, figure, and essential nature, these three are of one constitution. There is no distinction between these three. All three are of the nature of consciousness and bliss. In Krishna, there is no distinction between the body and the bearer of the body, or the name and the bearer of the name. The characteristic of the jiva, however, is that there is complete distinction between a jiva's name, body, and essential nature. Therefore, Krishna's name, figure, and play are not graspable by the material senses. They are self-manifest. Krishna's name, qualities, and Krishna's leelas are one with Krishna's essential nature. They are all of the nature of consciousness and bliss. So the name that we have is actually the name of our body. When we die, we're not known by that name anymore. Nor do we, or does the essential nature of the self, namely the atma, remain ever with the body. It's distinct from the body, and it's distinct from the name that's attached to the body. So the body, the name, and the nature, these three are all separate in the case of the jiva. But in the case of Bhagavan, these three are all considered to be one, or three expressions of one entity. So, yet, as it was cited in a verse of the Namashtakam, which was given earlier, the name, although is non-different than the form, non-different than the essential nature of Krishna, still each of these features can be identified to have some special characteristics, and the name is said to have the characteristic of being extra beneficial or merciful to the jivas conditioned in samsara. So there's, you can say, simultaneous distinction and non-distinction. And we'll get into a little bit of that here in the last paragraph. So, the commentator adds that, quote, complete means all-pervading, as was clearly perceived in Sri Krishna's lila of being bound about the belly with a rope by Mother Yashoda. Or in other words, when she saw that he was an all-pervading entity. That, quote, pure means beyond the gunas of Prakriti, and that the name is for these reasons said to be eternally liberated. Or in other words, when one is all-pervading and one is not in any way conditioned by the gunas, then one is eternally free from anything of samsara. So that's one way that pure or complete, pure, and eternally liberated can be interpreted. But he offers some alternate interpretations as well. He adds, however, that these qualifiers can also be interpreted in reverse, meaning the name is eternally liberated, therefore pure, and therefore complete. How the name, which is made up of syllables, can be a thought jewel, thus a form of Krishna, and moreover an embodiment of consciousness and rasa, complete, pure, and eternally liberated, is explained in the final phrase, quote, because of the name and the bearer of the names being non-different. The sense being that it is only as though they are distinct from one another, meaning although they are actually non-different, there remains a notion of there being a difference between them. The complete meaning being that they are two manifestations of one and the same entity, the essential nature of which is eternal being, consciousness, bliss, rasa, and so forth. So one entity simultaneously self-manifest as a form and as a name. And as such, exhibiting certain qualities a little more so with the name or with the form as per what is described throughout the Shastra. So in this way, we get discussion in these 3 verses we've discussed today of intrinsic characteristics of the name, that it is itself para-Brahman, it is itself non-different from Bhagavan, and it is, complete, pure, constituted of consciousness, constituted of rasa, ever free from mundanity, and yet able to self-manifest within the mundane by its own agency, overriding the nature of materiality. And we also heard in verse 24 this progression of how the name delivers a jiva from samsara, by purifying their mind, by bringing about their eligibility to follow the path of bhakti, by bringing them to the feet of the guru, by enabling them to achieve knowledge of Bhagavan, to thus removing the ignorance, which is the fundamental anchor of the jiva that keeps the jiva in samsara, and thereby ultimately brings the jiva into the bliss of eternal service to Krishna. So in this way, we have more discussion of both intrinsic and extrinsic characteristics of the name. So we've got still another 4 or 5 verses in this prakaran. So we'll hear more about the name in the next reading, and this will continue up through verse 31, where we get to the 2nd verse of the Shikshastakam. So I'll conclude here for today. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or otherwise, please feel free to share.
Does the name has its form?
Does the name have a form? Is that the question?
Yes.
Sure. I mean, we could say in 2 senses. One, Bhakti Bihari Krishna is the form of the name. In other words, the person Krishna is the name's form. That's one way we could say it. Or that all the various names of Bhagavan have a form in the sense that they have a sonic form in the quote-unquote form of the sound that we hear them in, such as Krishna, Hari, Govinda, the particular sound that by which we're acquainted with them. And you could go further and say that the letters that constitute these names, these phonemes, are also a form of the name. And in the classical view, the Jiva Goswami Vyakaran view, the varnas or the phonemes that constitute the language are also manifest from Bhagavan, and even the, what you call aksharas of the name are also, can be regarded as one of the name's forms. Is that all right? Okay, I'll assume so. So I'll leave it at that for today, and we'll continue further into this Nam Mahatmya, and then we'll get to the glory of Nama Kirtan, and then the glory of Krishna Katha, and then things will get, I don't want to say more interesting, but to imply that this is not interesting, but the Padyavali goes up and up and up and up, or you could say we're in the general discussion at this stage. The early 100 verses or so can discuss, standard features of the nature of Bhakti, the nature of Bhagavan, the nature of the name, and so forth. And then as Rupapad goes further, then we get more and more into descriptions of the beauty of Bhagavan's Leela and Braja and his parikaras and his exchanges and forms and expressions, and we go, you could say, from general to more and more specific. So we're well on our way, and hopefully we'll enjoy every step as we go. All right, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namo, Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.